intrapersonal communication as opposed to interpersonal communication, which is what you and I are doing right now. It's a bit one-sided, but I am communicating, you're listening, that's interpersonal. Intrapersonal communication is whatever was going on in your mind during that unexpected and awkward pause, whatever you were saying to yourself, whatever you were wondering, any interaction you had with the screen while you were trying to figure out whether the slide was advancing properly or not. That is intrapersonal communication. Here are some more examples. Talking to yourself, self-talk, the chatter that goes on in our heads from time to time, as mentioned and discussed in Chapter 3 of our textbook. Any kind of arguing with yourself, or coaching yourself, or encouraging yourself, or daydreaming, or imagining yourself in particular situations. What my colleague at LSU calls imagined interactions, the rehearsed conversations that we often play out in our heads in anticipation of a conflict negotiation, or a job interview, or a first date, and so forth. Any kind of thinking or problem solving, the System 2 hard work we do to crunch some numbers or solve a problem or work something out. That is intrapersonal communication, communication with ourselves. Some would suggest that meditation is a form of interpersonal communication, and even prayer, to some extent, is certainly a conversation in part with oneself. And what about responding to indicators? You hear a noise, you're startled, you walk into an odd neighborhood, you feel creepy, you get a warm feeling when you walk into someone's house from the environmental cues. Clearly some unconscious module in your brain is sending a message and alerting your conscious mind, as in the famous case where your name or name of your hometown jumps out from the background noise from a radio or TV broadcast. Then obviously one part of the brain is communicating with another. Is that intrapersonal communication? Is that you communicating with yourself? We're on a little bit of slippery ground here, for obvious reasons, because the idea of the self has been discussed and debated in philosophy for millennia, and we're not going to get a full handle on it today, but here are just a few hints at trying to get a handle on this mysterious and elusive idea of what the self is. I mean, certainly we can define it formally as a flexible system of memories, habits, and perceptions. It is that, but where did it come from? We can think of it as a conversation between I and me. Very often, and we've all experienced that, when you talk to yourself and ask yourself why you just did something. That's some strange stuff, but we do it every day. Certainly in the Eastern traditions, our senses, emotions, thoughts, habits, and consciousness are all aspects of what we would call ourselves, and most of us would probably agree with that. So is it then just a mental construct like vision? We seem to see things clearly, but in fact our eyes register everything upside down. Our brains have to make corrections. Everything we see is in fact what was actually present a tenth of a second ago, because it takes that long to process the image, and so forth. Is the self kind of a set of mental tricks? Some contemporary philosophers say so. Or it is a subjective experience, a kind of an illusion that we use to get through the day, like optical illusions that are still quite useful. We won't solve all that now, but the idea is that this idea of the self is a mysterious one and somewhat slippery. So where does I come from? The grammatical problem in that question is done on purpose. Probably most of us have heard of the famous nature versus nurture debate, first classified as such in the 19th century. Nature, that is our genetic heritage, versus our environment. We might say in older terms our character versus our circumstances. On the nature side, certainly some things are in fact inherited. You're not going to get Huntington's disease unless one of your parents carried the gene for it. On the other hand, the language you speak and think in is 100% a product of where you happen to be born and the language the folks around you were speaking. When we're speaking of education, is it correct to speak of gifted children, or is it better to say every child can learn? Well, it's a bit of both. To make a very long story extremely short, the scientific consensus is that we are all a vast array of genetic predispositions. We're thrown into the world with a tremendously complex set of genetic predispositions that are nourished or not, suppressed or not, by a vast and largely random range of environmental factors, among which, to put a suggestive but extremely partial list: culture, language, social class, family dynamics, the order in which you're born into the family, even the climate, the literal climate of the geographical area you're born into, and certainly communication with significant others in our early lives. That is a very partial list of what is involved in developing that sense we all have of who we are and who we identify with. If we're talking about nature and nurture, it might be tempting to say, we're partly genetic and partly environmental, like this map, partly red and partly blue. But it's much more complex than that. Here's a better map of the political map of the country, adjusted county by county and for population density. So when we're saying we're a product of our genetic makeup and our environment, it can't ever be separated this neatly. It's at least this complex and unpredictable. Here's a quick example, because we'll be spending a longer time on the communication and nurture side for obvious reasons. It's a communication class. But something you would find on the nature side in any discussion of genetics, cognitive psychology, interpersonal psychology, neurobiology, and so forth. On that entire side, which is a whole degree program in itself, on the nature side, psychologists frequently work with what they are called trait theories. That is to say, classifications of specific genetic predispositions or traits that most of us tend to be born with or may be developed to some extent, but not infinitely flexible by our backgrounds and environments. One of the most famous is called the Big Five. It is an attempt by psychologists nationwide over the last generation to classify the baffling array of vocabulary that has been used for centuries to describe human character and reduce as much of it to as few words as possible. One can remember the list of words by the obvious acronym OCEAN, although folks from up north or the folks who like the outdoors might prefer the acronym CANOE. That works too. But essentially a trait toward openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, and their opposites. One can think of the Big Five as scales along which each of us may be arranged, personal constructs, those yardstick schema, along which we may arrange ourselves or place ourselves and anybody else. And it's important to note that these are all designed to be value-neutral descriptions of particular personality traits. It's not that the high end is good and the low end is bad. That's obvious when we look at the last one of these. And whether it is good or bad to be extroverted or introverted makes no sense. And certainly, although agreeableness sounds pretty good, we've all met people who are hyper agreeable and can't and never assert their opinions at all in any situation. So a little bit of each on that one, on that scale, goes quite a long way. Now, let's spend the rest of the time looking at the nurture side of the debate, which involves communication. From the communication perspective, and for obvious reasons in the field of communication, the idea that we are who we are as a result of human communication is a very influential viewpoint, and we may think from this side of the equation or the debate of ourselves as a social construction. That is to say, we are looking at the formation of who we are from what has been called a social constructionist or a symbolic interactionist perspective, which states that the self arises, and we will say in part, certainly the self arises in part through communication with significant others in our families, communities, and cultures. This goes back to a perspective devised by the great American sociologist George Herbert Mead in the 60s that has been summarized and quoted extensively throughout the communication literature for the last couple of generations. From this perspective, we live in three worlds of meaning, language, and thought. We act toward others on the basis of the meanings we ascribe to them. And we talked about ascribing meanings or attributions earlier on in the course. Those meanings are derived from social interactions we have with other people in our society, in language. And they are handled in an interpretive process we use in dealing with what we encounter. It's almost as though you could arrange those things in a little triangle. And I have noticed the similarity between this particular set of terms here and our old friend the semiotic triangle, but haven't quite been able to prove yet that even though this idea arose around the same time, that there's a lot of overlap. At any rate, from this perspective on language, human interaction, and the development of the human mind, we get a few powerful implications, some of which will seem quite commonsensical to you. Number one is that a great deal of who we are and who we think we are develops through our communication with other people in our family, our network of peers, certainly in childhood, and with society as a whole. Number two is that we have a tremendous amount of who we think we are is in fact the reflections of what other people think about us. What has been called the Pygmalion effect, or the looking glass self in older language, or in clearer terms, reflected appraisal, refers to assessing who we are based on how we imagine other people are perceiving us. And if you've ever walked into a room and wondered what other people think of you and started to guess about it, then you have experienced this effect, and you probably experience it every day. If you revise your impression of yourself or measure yourself against what you think others are or what they think you are, then you've certainly experienced this, and I think we all have. So, anytime you ask someone how you look or behave, or anytime you interpret other people's behavior toward you, and in fact you are assessing yourself as though you're surrounded by all these human mirrors that are showing you who you are and how you measure. And that can lead in many cases to one of the most famous implications of the symbolic interactionist or social construction perspective, the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. And it is formally defined as a false conception of a situation that inspires behavior on your part that helps make the false conception come true. So it is not exactly that think and grow rich or the power of positive thinking. It's the idea that in a particular situation, if you believe someone's behavior toward you will be a certain way, your own behavior toward them will help them elicit that behavior on their part. And if you think someone's going to be rude, you may behave toward them somewhat defensively or tensely, which might inspire them to behave more defensively or, in your eyes, rudely. Certainly, in my line of work, There are lots of stories of teachers who have taught students differently based on what their expectations are of the students, even though all they know about the students are what grades they got in previous classes or the year before. Communication with the family boils down to what we might call direct definitions. We have all been told what we are by significant others in our families, and very often still are as young adults or mature adults, and by identity scripts, sometimes called life scripts. These are the heuristics, the rules of thumb. And in many cases, this combination of direct definitions and identity scripts leads us to have a particular attachment style in later life. If the pattern of messages we get in our families are positive or negative or a combination of the two, many people find that their tendency to attach to other people in later life is profoundly affected by this pattern of messages in the family in early life. Once again, the deep and pervasive connection between communication and psychology, or rhetoric, and our sense of self. Communication with our peers, our colleagues, friends, and co-workers. We've talked about reflected appraisals already. Certainly there are direct definitions involved with those folks too. But in many cases we make social comparisons, that yardstick schema, those scales on which we rank ourselves and others. And of course we can misrank people, but we can also use a scale based on limited or local experience that doesn't serve us well when we get into the wider world, a larger workplace, an international corporation, leave the state, go from a high school to a university, and so forth. And a tremendous amount of communication with peers and the relationships we develop with them begins with self-disclosure. A marvelous image of self-disclosure was drawn up in the 70s by this silly name, the Johari window. I mean, look at it. It looks like looks like what Windows looked like in 1970. Look at the 4 panes of glass and the wood between them. And if you look at the names of the researchers, you can see where the silly name came from. Joe and Harry came up with the name of it. But the point is that we can classify every last thing about ourselves into these 4 squares. There is stuff that we are open about. There's stuff we're blind to, there's stuff we're hiding, and the most mysterious area, our area of our potential or untapped talent, for good or evil, our unknown area. What we don't know about ourselves because we've not been in the right circumstances or situations. It's been suggested that the more we expand the open area, the smaller the other areas get, and the easier our relationships may be in our family and our workplaces. And communication with society seems like a mysterious concept, but it's actually quite concrete. We can think of being told what society wants. I mean, occasionally, sometimes significant friends and family members simply tell us flat out that we fit into society or we don't. But we certainly get a sense of reflected appraisal and social comparisons with respect to our race or ethnic group or gender or sexual orientation, socioeconomic level, and there are quite a few others that we might think of as well. And how does society tell us where we fit? Quite simply. Very often the nonverbal behavior of other people in public and semi-public areas lets us know exactly that we fit in or we don't, or we're members of the club and we're not. And certainly the images and stories and the pattern of content we see in mass media sources gives us messages every day. Even if they're not explicit, we sometimes, from a pattern of messages, or what's left out in mass media sources, what gets praised or made fun of by large numbers of people in mass media, can influence how we think someone like us, whatever that might be, fits into society as a whole.